our book, Inequality Across State Lines, with Caitlin Sidorsky, who's a Brown PhD and now tenured at Coastal Carolina University. And we wanted to write something about inequality and policy for women. In other words, how do women live state to state? We think about abortion rights, contraceptive access, and wage equality, which is really important, pay equity. But in the end of the day, states pass so many laws that affect the daily lives of women. And are you better off in Maine or Rhode Island or California or Illinois or Florida if you're a woman? And so how do you tackle that? Right. And the fundamental premise, first of all, is your human security. You know, how safe are you from violence? And so we started with sort of the area of sexual and physical violence against women. And then we narrowed it down because there are laws about domestic violence, and that domestic violence in particular was sort of a hidden thing. In fact, some people still think it's a private matter, which it most certainly is not. It has widespread implications for communities, in particular with lethal domestic violence and the use of guns. And so when you think about it, that's the fundamental premise. If you are not safe in your own home, if you suffer from psychological abuse, coercion, coercive control, or physical abuse, you're not secure, and you can't be an equal citizen. And so we wanted to look at state laws and say, okay, how safe are you in these different states? And the rubric really starts with the Violence Against Women Act, which was passed in 1994 by the Congress, sponsored by then Senator Joe Biden. And that created the first recognition, really. There have been family violence bills, but this was domestic violence is a public crime. It's a public matter, and the government has a responsibility to try to keep women safe. That's at the federal level. And then we wanted to see how well states implement federal law and how do they correspond to federal law and how well does the system actually work.
And then you mentioned in your book how women's safety differ state by state, and the lack of general federal guidelines exacerbate this issue even more for the safety of women. Can you elaborate a little bit on what you meant by those differences?
Sure. I mean, we hone in on two aspects of this. One is the federal VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, has provisions that say if you commit a felony, domestic violence, you cannot have a gun. But the only way to prosecute a federal domestic violence charge is if there's kidnapping across state lines. So states do the bulk of it. So in 1996, another federal amendment was passed, the Lautenberg Amendment, that says if you're convicted of misdemeanor domestic violence anywhere, you can't have a gun. And that has been really important. And the interpretation of VAWA is that you cannot give or allow somebody to possess a gun if they're under a domestic violence restraining order, which is a hugely crucial way of trying to protect women. Because the most dangerous time for women in a violent relationship is when they're trying to leave. When they've separated, filed for divorce, or trying to leave. That's when so much violence happens. And this is really important for everybody to realize about domestic violence, is when you read about a family where some intimate partner has killed the wife or the ex-wife, they've killed children, they've killed bystanders. 68% of mass shooters have some involvement with domestic violence. So there is a community impact to domestic violence, particularly gun-motivated domestic violence. And it's really something that states deal with these sort of 8 particular laws that states pass. And some states pass those laws, some states don't, some enforce them and implement them, some don't. And there's such wide variation, almost county to county, about whether judges issue restraining orders, whether they prevent gun possession, whether they take away a gun. So it's really so enmeshed in our criminal justice system right now.
Can we also discuss the sort of inequality that this creates? You began talking about it a little bit, about if you're not safe, if your person is not secure, you can't be an equal citizen. And so what kind of inequality does this breed in our society when we have these laws that are not really protecting victims of domestic violence?
So the inequality comes from the inability to be economically self-sufficient, the inability to sort of make your own choices, the inability to live free of physical and sexual and psychological assault. But it also exacerbates existing inequalities in terms of race and immigration status. In particular, Black women face a different experience when they call law enforcement for help with domestic violence. They are more likely to be arrested than white women. It's called dual arrest. So they're hesitant to call. And then we know that nearly 70% of women who are incarcerated have either experienced domestic violence, been the victim of it, or grew up in a household with it. So it breeds and produces cultures of violence across all categories, socially constructed categories of race and ethnicity, and immigrants in particular who are not yet legalized or citizens of the United States. They may be legal immigrants but not citizens. They are very fearful of calling the authorities. So there's these levels of inequality that already exist, and they are greatly exacerbated in that their safety is even less secure than the average white woman. But domestic violence pervades every economic class. You can have wealthy people commit domestic violence and kill their partners. We've seen a number of cases in the New England area like this, down to lowest economic strata. It is not just something that is confined to people in a particular economic category.
And then let's talk about how, for policymakers, what can they do to address some of these issues? But then before we do that, let's even first talk about the relationship with the NRA and domestic violence.
Right. So Hami, that's a really important point, is that the rise of the marriage of the National Rifle Association with the Republican Party over the last 30 years, now they are symbiotic. They are one. And that has blocked not only federal legislation on gun safety, but also at the state level, blocked some states from enacting more strict restrictions on individuals who have committed domestic violence on owning, buying, or possessing guns. You know, they'll insist on time limit expirations for things like that. They are opposed to really thorough background checks, seeing if somebody has a domestic violence assault conviction, and just generally supporting the overall level of guns in our society. Even if it's not a legally purchased weapon, somebody who's angry at a spouse or an intimate partner can get a gun and then kill them and kill themselves. And so this has become, you know, a public health threat that is exacerbated and exaggerated by the lockstep of the Republican Party with the NRA. And it takes the brave Republican legislator in some of these states, and we've seen examples of this in places like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, where they're Republican and they go to the state legislature and they say, we just want to protect women from getting killed.
Right.
We don't want to take away a law-abiding person's gun. Let us do this. And it's just been a battle royale, and it shows no sign of abating, unfortunately. And it's really, people worry, why do we have all these mass shootings? And again, let me just reiterate, this comes out of Johns Hopkins University. Studies have shown that the vast majority of mass shooters have experience with or were domestic violence perpetrators. And it starts with domestic violence.
So addressing this will have positive externalities for society beyond just protecting women.
No question about it. First of all, women will be safer, lead more productive, healthy lives. Their children will not grow up in houses full of violence. And we will be safer in general when people who are violent do not have access to guns. And if you've displayed violence against your family, you know, what makes people think that somebody wouldn't hesitate to commit violence against a stranger?
Okay. And then in your book, you also mentioned things like the lack of resources and funding for programs to support domestic violence victims. I know anecdotal stories of friends of mine who wanted access to resources for, you know, sexual abuse or domestic violence situations, but had to wait 6 months to get one meeting with providers and so on.
Yes,
and so
it's a very, very terrible problem, because there's also legal entanglements when you live in the same house. And you share the mortgage, let's say, or on the title, and your spouse is abusive, then judges sort of have to figure out, how do we maintain somebody's rights until they're convicted? And it becomes very difficult. And there was a tragic case in Michigan where a judge did that and said, this person's still living in the house. It's still his house. I can't bar him from the house. Of course, he returned to the house and murdered his whole family. So these are horrible. But housing, the housing crisis really is also related to the domestic violence solutions, because you can't find temporary shelter that is safe and anonymous for victims and their children of domestic violence, because we have just a general housing crunch.
And then, so you also, in your book, you talk about some of the solutions and recommendations that you have. Can you elaborate on what those solutions, recommendations are for policymakers, lawmakers in general, the courts, because you also talk about the relationship with the courts. And then what are the challenges to getting those things done?
There are two things. One is a lethality assessment program developed by the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. probably more than 20 years ago. And this is used by not most, but many police departments. It is a set of 11 questions. It asks the victim some questions. And if it's clear that the victim is in lethal danger from their answers, the law enforcement can call right then and there social services to give the victims help. And this has proven to be very effective, getting the victims out of harm's way as best as possible. And so that's really important. There is federal funding. $500 million goes out for grants on domestic violence. The second is trying to find social workers, and we have to fund our social workers much better than we do in the United States, to go with police officers on domestic violence calls to see, okay, does this require incarceration?
Right.
Does it require mental health counseling, alcohol counseling, substance abuse counseling? Is there a firearm present? I mean, what will lead to a lethal situation?
Right.
The problem is that these are very dangerous situations. 25% of all law enforcement injuries and deaths come from serving domestic violence warrants or answering domestic violence calls. So it's so dangerous, you can't put civilians in harm's way.
Right.
So developing team-based policies where you can maybe have a social worker who doesn't go into the home, but once it's secured can come in and recommend what might need to be done. This will reduce automatic incarceration, which we are not proposing. You know, we want to take the means of violence out of the hands of domestic violence abusers and get them help. We want to try to keep families intact where we can.
Right.
And if particularly immigrant families, but particularly if you think that your intimate partner will be arrested and they are the breadwinner, you're not going to call the police.
Right.
Right. So these are things as a society we have to bring together holistically. And I know every state has a coalition against domestic violence. They do receive donations and support and help. And so when you want to do something about domestic violence, the first place to start is your own state coalition against domestic violence.
Thank you. And then this is a personal question. Are there any successful example of policy approaches from other countries, regions that you've seen throughout your work? And then what can we do as individuals when it comes to addressing this?
Well, there's
question?
already evidence coming from Carolina Diaz et al. And also April Zioli that the laws that keep firearms out of the hands of domestic violence abusers, particularly under restraining orders, do reduce violent death in domestic violence situations. So keeping guns out of the hands of abusers does save lives. We know this already. There is a appeals court decision called Rahimi out of Louisiana that threatens that very provision, saying that it's unconstitutional when you're under a restraining order to bar somebody from having a gun. The Supreme Court has just agreed. The Biden administration appealed that, and the Supreme Court just agreed to hear that case in the next term. And it has upheld the provisions in VAWA so far. And the question is, will it uphold this? And if it doesn't, I can tell you for sure that more women's lives and children's lives will be in danger.
Wow. And then lastly, what can we do?
We can pay attention to our own communities and our own families. If somebody isn't as available as they used to be, if you're not invited to their home, if you go to their home and it seems as though they're not allowed to bring you in, or there's coercive control, they don't seem to have access to finances. If these signals are happening, or if there's a coworker that doesn't show up for work a lot, is out sick, these things can really be indicative of violence in the home. And you don't want to reach out necessarily always directly, but you certainly want to reach out to your coalition against domestic violence at the state level or organizations at your local level.
Dr. Schiller, thank you so much for being on Let's Just
My
Talk.
pleasure.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.